Perhaps one of the most memorable parts of Star Wars: The Clone Wars was Hondo Ohnaka and his pirate crew, a gang of questionably intelligent thugs who, more often than not, served as comic relief on the show.
I'm flying!
Hondo and his men are perhaps Star Wars' most prominent members of the Weequay species, one of many sentient races known primarily for their role as thugs for underworld powers. But while Hondo might be the most well-known Weequay, he was unlike most of his people in many respects. Typically, Weequays were quiet, untrusting, and highly superstitious, and their religion prominently involved the veneration of what were essentially magic 8-balls. In this video, we're going to be taking a close look at the Weequays and their peculiar beliefs.
I smell profit!
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The Weequays hailed from the planet Shrila, the sector capital of the Periphery, a northern subsector of Hutt space that was later annexed by the Empire. This planet lay upon the Sisar Run, a major route leading into Hutt space, which made it fairly prominent in the regional economy. This was despite the fact that Shrila was a desolate and singularly unpleasant world with acidic oceans, dust-choked skies, and continents covered by white sand deserts, scrubland, and badlands. Most of the northern hemisphere was covered by an enormous crater-filled desert, while the southern hemisphere had numerous volcanoes and black glass canyons. Shrila's oceans were constantly churned up by the tidal influences of its 5 moons, which included Quay, which shone bright in Shrila's night sky, and Rul, which was a habitable tropical paradise. Its crust and seas had vast reserves of copper, but these were largely ignored by the Weequays, whose economy was built around mining more valuable metals and gems that could be found deep in Shrila's crust, which they traded for regular shipments of purified water. All told, Shrila was quite inhospitable, but there was life there anyway. The Weequays evolved in this hostile environment, and they were well suited to it. They were humanoids with dark, beady eyes, which were recessed into their skulls for protection against sand, and thick, leathery skin, which was wrinkled and rough to the touch. This skin was incredibly tough, meant to resist the harsh elements of Shrila, and it made Weequays highly resistant to cuts, burns, blunt trauma, and, to an extent, even blaster fire. It took a lot to break through a Weequay's hide, and Weequay's durability wasn't even skin deep. Their bones were also denser than most humanoids and were very hard to break. This natural durability made the Weequays very effective fighters, which was why they were so commonly employed as mercenaries or thugs. The Weequays' other notable feature was their pheromones, which were complex and could be used to communicate. Each Weequay exuded a unique set of pheromones that served as a personal identifier to other members of their clan, and they could communicate exclusively through pheromones when with members of the same clan. Weequays only spoke when among other clans or with outsiders, and even then, most of them only spoke rarely, and they next to never used complete sentences, which led some to believe they were unintelligent. The Weequays, for their part, looked down on beings whom they had to communicate verbally with and preferred the company of their clanmates. Groups of off-world Weequays sometimes even took to hiring a trusted off-worlder to speak for them rather than speaking to non-Weequays directly. Their unique system of pheromone communication made Weequay clans very insular, and many of them were xenophobic to some degree or another. Within their clans, Weequays were highly collectivist. They usually didn't even have names, since names were unnecessary when their pheromones were always unique. Usually, Weequays only took names for themselves when operating among other clans or groups of outsiders for extended periods, and even then, many of them just went by Weequay. Weequays usually thought of themselves as parts of a clan rather than individuals, and they believed that the interests of the clan should always be prioritized over those of individual members. Originally, Weequay clans were nomadic, but as they steadily grew in size over the millennia, they settled down in large coastal clan cities where they were able to establish sufficient agriculture to support their population. In keeping with their strongly clan-based society, Weequays typically weren't the biggest spacefarers, with most only leaving Shrila when hired for a job. Those Weequays who left Shrila often grew their hair out into long seclusion braids, which they grew one of for every year spent away from their homeworld. When they returned to Srilor, they would shave these braids off, and most Weequays on Srilor itself shaved regularly. The Weequays were a very superstitious people, prone to seeing patterns where there were none and attributing anything they couldn't understand to supernatural entities like water nymphs. Most Weequays were also very religious. Their religion was polytheistic and highly complex, involving many rituals and regular sacrifices to various gods. At the center of each city on Srilor was a shrine of black, polished stone called thal, which were used to offer up food and valuable items to the gods. Weequays on Srilor primarily showed their devotion through sacrifices at the thal, but as Weequay custom forbade building these shrines off-world Weequays had to show their devotion in other ways, usually through the live sacrifice of large animals. Some particularly zealous off-world Weequays were known to sacrifice sentient beings, which led some to think of Weequay culture as murderous and bloodthirsty. The Weequays worshipped many gods, among them the thunder god Shuk and their chief god, the moon god Quay. Quay was identified with the moon of the same name, and the Weequays lived their lives in devotion to him. Indeed, the name Weequay meant follower of Quay. They worshipped their gods through totems that symbolized each deity's sphere of control, the most infamous of which was the Quay totem. This was a small, white plastic sphere that bore a resemblance to the moon Quay, and it essentially functioned as a magic 8-ball. A Weequay would ask their Quay a question, shake the totem, and it would provide one of a pre-programmed set of responses in a loud, booming voice. These responses were mostly vague and non-committal, but the Weequays believed that they were messages from Quay itself, and they would get violently angry if anyone dared to question their Quay's messages in their presence. Nearly every Weequay owned a Quay, and they would consult it for every important decision they made. The most zealous of them believed that a Quay's first answer was final, while others were known to spend hours shaking their Quays to get the answers they wanted, reasoning that the Quay's more non-committal responses were because Quay was busy answering other Weequays' questions, and that they just had to be patient. They even let their Quays dictate their relationships. A Weequay that desired another as a mate would ask their Quay if it was a wise idea, and if the Quay said yes, they would seek out their prospective partner, who would then consult their own Quay. The two would then repeatedly shake their Quays until both provided the same answer, and if the answer was yes, they would be married. If this seems like a rather shaky basis for a marriage, don't worry, Weequays would also be divorced in the same way. The only decision Weequays didn't consult their Quays about was whether or not to have children. Their approach there was just to mate and assume they would be given children if the gods willed it. Of course, that didn't stop expectant Weequays from eagerly asking their Quays about the gender and number of the children they would have. All of this, it should be noted, primarily applies to Weequays who were born and raised on Srilor among a Weequay clan. Weequays who had spent most of their lives among off-worlders, such as those who became Jedi or those who were sold into slavery as young children, almost never adhered to any of these beliefs. These Weequays typically felt alienated from the rest of their species and sometimes felt a sort of second-hand embarrassment about them. Notable examples of such Weequays included Jedi Master and later Dark Acolyte, Sora Bulk, as well as Hondo Ohnaka and most of his gang, who were slaves of the Hutts before they escaped and became pirates. Hondo, in particular, held the Weequay religion in contempt, as he had been sold into slavery by his own parents after their Quays told them to. Hondo and most of his followers thus abandoned many aspects of Weequay culture, adopting more laissez-faire, outgoing personalities than most members of their species. Despite what their simple and fairly low-tech civilization might have suggested, the Weequays first took to the stars centuries before the Republic. They didn't do this of their own accord, however. Srilor was an early territory of the Hutt Empire, and Hutts brought many Weequays off-world for use as soldiers in their armies. Unlike most other species in their region of space, however, the Weequays weren't slaves of the Hutts. They were Hutt vassals, but they retained a degree of independence even through 25,000 years of Hutt domination, allowing them to carve out a place for themselves in the galaxy. Nonetheless, the Weequays tended to follow the Hutts' lead, and from their first contact with the Hutts onward, vast numbers of them served the Hutts as mercenaries, acting as soldiers, guards, and enforcers. In this capacity, the Weequays were spread across Hutt space, and eventually the rest of the Outer Rim, and over time, many of them began to serve as mercenaries for other criminal factions as well. Weequays were a popular choice for crime lords seeking bodyguards, and other Weequays joined pirate gangs. Due to their affiliation with the Hutts, Weequays were rarely seen in the service of legitimate organizations, though they were very prominent in the galactic underworld. As a people, however, the Weequays mostly kept to themselves, and it was only in the final centuries of Republic history that Shrelor became involved in a noteworthy conflict. That conflict began in 282 BBY when a large group of Houk from nearby Lejuta attempted to establish colonies on Shrelor. The Houk were unintelligent and fairly low tech, but they were among the strongest species in the galaxy, rivaling even the Wookiees, and they were well known for how they preferred to use violence to get what they wanted. About 40,000 Houk came to Shrelor in the Republic's final centuries, establishing large settlements out in the deserts and smaller communities in Weequay clan cities. The Weequays, predictably, weren't happy with this arrangement, and violence erupted. Though the Houk were not the first outsiders to settle on Shrelor, they were so brazen and intrusive, the Weequays quickly came to consider them cultural enemies. War began, and as you might expect for a territorial conflict between two typically violent and unreasonable species, it continued off and on for centuries. The Weequay and the Houk hate each other so much that even off-world members of the two species with no real ties to their homeworlds would often go at each other. A prime example of such a skirmish happened in Eastport on Coruscant during the Separatist Crisis, when a group of Weequay and a group of Houk were placed in adjacent holding rooms while going through Coruscant immigration. This alone was enough to start a 3-hour battle that wreaked havoc in the spaceport and left 15 dead and 45 wounded. Charges were pressed against the initiators, but they just attacked each other again during their arraignment, pulverizing the bailiffs and having a brawl right in the courtroom. The Houk-Weequay conflict only ended after the Empire, afraid that the two species might start a wider regional war, annexed the periphery and occupied Shrelor. So, that's our look at the Weequays. But what do you think? Were you familiar with the tradition of the Quay totems? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.